Hello, everybody. Hello, everyone. My name is Jason Webb. I'm here in two capacities. One as a professor over in comparative literature, and secondly, as the associate director of the Shinzo Ito Center for Japanese Religions and Culture. It is my great pleasure today to convene an event that is co-sponsored by the Department of Comparative Literature and the Ito Center. This is the second installment in our Environmental Humanities speaker series, and we are delighted to have Professor Jon Pitt. And we're also equally delighted to have Professor Natanya Meeker, who will serve as a discussant today. So in a slightly circuitous fashion, I'm going to introduce Natanya briefly and then ask Natanya to introduce the speaker. But I did want to make a little bit of a clarification about the structure of today's event. So roughly 50 minutes or so is what we've asked Professor Pitt to speak on. And following that, we'll have about 10 minutes from Professor Natanya Meeker. And after that, we'll do some Q&A. And so those of you who are dialing in from far-flung places and not in the room together with us, please feel free to go to the little toolbar at the bottom of the Zoom screen. You'll see a Q&A session, and if you post your questions, they will form a queue that I will be able to see. And then once we get to the Q&A session, we'll alternate between the in-person venue and the global audience. So I hope that's okay with everybody in the interest of fairness. So without further ado, again, I'd like to introduce my dear friend and colleague, Professor Natanya Meeker, who is no stranger to things humanistic and botanical, and so she's far more qualified than I am to take this role introducing Professor Pitt and his research. So thanks very much, Natanya. Yes, sure.
Thank you so much. I just want to say a huge thank you to Professor Webb and to the center, as well as to the Student-Led Activities Fund in the Department of Comparative Literature, to the audience, and of course to Professor Pitt for joining us today. Jon Pitt is Assistant Professor of Japanese Environmental Humanities at the University of California, Irvine. He earned his PhD in Japanese from the University of California, Berkeley. And his current book project, which had a tentative title, Becoming Botanical, Rethinking the Human Through Plant Life in Modern Japan, studies Japanese film, literature, culture, and history through the lens of critical plant studies, thereby enriching both fields and demonstrating in really beautiful prose the ways in which a turn to the plants can reveal both the promise and the peril of human thought and practice. In this book, forthcoming soon from Cornell University Press, Professor Pitt's focus on plant being and plant becoming allows him to excavate the connections between science and colonial violence, plant classification and human migration, the politics of forest management, and experimental film, to name only a few of the very generative links that he traces between human modes of domination and the production of botanically animated works of art. Professor Pitt's work stretches across disciplines, methods, and media. In his engagements with plant life and botanical becoming, he models the kind of transformative potentiality that he also finds in vegetal beings, knitting together disparate styles of communication, representation, and creative production in order to bring multiple constituencies into the ambit of the critical plant. He is the translator of poet Ito Hiromi's Tree Spirits, Grass Spirits, published in 2023 by Nightboat Books, and the host of the environmental humanities podcast, Nature: Mono, or Mono, the first season of which is dedicated to the theme of oceanic Japan. And he is also a musician. At Irvine, Professor Pitt is a recipient of the School of Humanities Senate Faculty Teaching Excellence Award. I like to mention teaching awards because I think they're very important and a key distinction. He is also the author of a number of articles and book chapters that demonstrate his engagement with critical plant studies as a means of reopening and re-envisioning key historical and political questions around the formation of national and collective identities. Those articles include documenting wordless testimony, botanical witnesses of Hiroshima and Chernobyl, which appeared in Angelaki in 2023, and Becoming Marimo, the curious case of a charismatic algae and imagined indigeneity, which appeared in the edited volume Being Algae, Transformations in Water Plants. While critical plant studies has often portrayed plants as a kind of harbor from human violence and trauma, Professor Pitt, in all of his work, does something that I think is much more interesting. He reveals how following the plants, in the words of Deleuze and Guattari, allows us new purchase on the specific social and cultural configurations that we inhabit. It is my honor and great pleasure to introduce Professor Pitt to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the really generous introduction. So I would like to begin by thanking the Ito Center here at USC, Shannon Takashi, who I don't think is in the room right now, but as well as Professors Webb and Meeker for their invitation and help in setting up this talk today. It's really an honor to be here as part of the Environmental Humanities speaker series. And I think it's really exciting that USC is doing this kind of series. I think it's a really good sign that Japanese studies is heading into a more environmentally minded territory. And I hope that my talk today demonstrates that there is a lot of potential for adopting more environmental humanities approaches to the study of Japanese media and culture more broadly. So my talk today, as you see in the slide here, is titled Moss as Evolutionary Kin, a Plant Humanities Reading of Osaki Midori. And this is drawn from the first chapter of my book project, which the tentative title is now Botanical Imagination, Rethinking Plants in Modern Japan. Let's see if I can move that. So this book is currently under contract, forthcoming from Cornell University Press, and it argues that that several writers and filmmakers in Japan's modern period saw something new in plants that extended beyond classical Japanese aesthetics, right? We conventionally associate all kinds of botanical imagery with Japanese culture, right? Cherry blossoms, ikebana flower arranging, bonsai trees, right? Those of you who are listening that might not know a whole lot about Japan, right? These are kind of some of the images that come into your mind if you think about Japanese culture. But the writers, filmmakers, these figures that I'm interested in and work on saw something different in plant life. And it's something at the intersection of art, science, spirituality, and the botanical potential that they found in plants really inspired them to rethink the question at the very heart of humanities scholarship, right? That fundamental question, what does it mean to be human? But they reframed the question, right? Asking instead, what would it mean for humans to be more like plants, right? And they hoped that becoming more plant-like in this way, and this is a trope that I call becoming botanical, they hoped that becoming botanical could serve as an imaginative response to moments of crisis in Japan's modern period. So my book is an attempt to bring the insights and methodologies of critical plant studies, which is also known as the plant humanities, right? To bring that world more fully into the realm of Japanese studies. At the same time, to bring Japanese studies into the realm of critical plant studies, which has heretofore largely focused on the traditions and knowledges of Europe and the Americas. Right? At the same time, the study of modern Japanese literature and cinema has, by and large, neglected a kind of serious engagement with plant life. Although there have been works of environmental history and anthropology that have turned a critical eye toward the botanical realm in Japan. So foregrounding plant life in my reading of modern Japanese literature and media and following the plants, right? By doing so, this book demonstrates that writers in Japan, and this is my argument, have been circling a lot of the questions that are being raised by present-day plant humanists, right? Plant humanities theorists, they've been circling these questions for decades, although they've largely done so outside of the halls of academia. And this is true, sorry, I'll click OK here, so that's not in our way. This is true of the subject of my first chapter, who is also the subject of my talk today. This is the modernist poet, short story writer, and early film critic Osaki Midori. And so I'm really happy to be talking about Osaki today because in many ways, her work was the inspiration for this overall book project. And here's what I mean. The inspiration really came while I was reading Osaki's moss-filled 1931 novella, Wandering in the Realm of the Seventh Sense, alongside Robin Wall Kimmerer's Gathering Moss. Many of you, both in the audience here today and online, are probably familiar with Kimmerer's better-known book, Braiding Sweetgrass, right? It's kind of bestseller, really important work. Gathering Moss was her first book. And like Braiding Sweetgrass, it is a very poetic discussion of plant life, in this case, moss, right? But it's a poetic discussion that was informed by intersecting forms of knowledge, right? Both conventionally scientific, as Kimmerer is a trained botanist, as well as indigenous, right? As Kimmerer is also a member of the citizen Potawatomi Nation. So reading Gathering Moss and then reading Osaki, I wondered what exactly was informing Osaki's poetic discussion of moss in 1930s Japan. Right? Critical plant studies invited me to follow the moss in Osaki's story and to try to tease out the knotty, overlapping histories of crisis, science, colonialism, as well as resistance that became legible in Osaki's work once I foregrounded the moss that is rather easily overlooked in Osaki's oeuvre. As the title of my talk today suggests, I read in Osaki's moss a kind of claim to a familial relationship in deep time, right? As Wandering in the Realm of the Seventh Sense casts moss as an evolutionary ancestor of human beings. Now, what's really interesting is it does so in a historical moment in which this ideology of social Darwinism was employed by the Japanese state to help justify colonial expansion. So at one level, Osaki turned to moss as a form of resistance to such ideology, right? Trying to imagine instead a kind of utopian vision of evolutionary thought that brought humans and plants closer together through this trope of becoming botanical. But as we'll see, following the moss in Osaki's writing also brings us to the history of Japanese colonial botany and agriculture. And this is a very different kind of becoming botanical that can't escape the role that plants played in Japan's imperial project. So that brings me to the first part of my talk, the uprooting of colonial modernity. And our story begins in June of 1930 in a movie theater in Tokyo. So here, in this movie theater, Osaki watched Max Fleischer's 1925 silent documentary film, Evolution. This is a film that recounts the history of the Earth from its earliest days to the evolutionary descent of human beings. Osaki would go on to write about evolution in her column Jottings on Film, Eiga Manso, which was published in the periodical Women's Arts. And she did this in August of the same year. Osaki recounts having an out-of-body experience while watching the film, of it drawing her in and putting her in touch with the deepest of time, before even the mythological creator deities of Japan, Izanagi and Izanami. So here's what Osaki writes. Quote, "Within the space of about 20 minutes, my mind, kokoro, in this case, leaves the Earth's surface and is released into a time before the gods Izanagi and Izanami. Within the space of about 20 minutes, I ponder a toy box-like philosophy. I, in quotes, become gas. I become a star. I become smoke. I become a slice of glacier. I become moss. I become a chameleon. I become a native. How skillful that a world without even the slightest whiff of culture can arouse a naive empathy in viewers. There are not many films that can fully absorb a viewer's mind, even for a second, into moss, into anger, into laughter, end quote. So in A Darkened Theater, Osaki visits various points on the evolutionary path towards humankind, and she imagines occupying other modes of being. Along the way, she loses a concrete sense of self. Her subjectivity becomes fluid, moving both through time and between states of matter. The film Evolution allows Osaki to rethink what it means to be human. Her mind is set adrift, and she repeatedly brackets the self-referential pronoun I. And so of all the stops along the evolutionary path that Osaki visits while watching the film, she only mentions one example twice, moss. Right? And this is no coincidence. For Osaki, moss and evolutionary thinking went hand in hand. Moss appears throughout Osaki's work and has become something of a symbol for the writer herself. Amidst the violent backdrop of Japan's early Showa period, this is a stretch of time that begins in 1926 and witnessed the intensification of Japanese colonialism and fascism. Right? So in this time period, Osaki found in moss a model for adaptation to rapidly changing and, to be sure, worsening times. And so Osaki is embracing the inclusiveness of evolutionary theory and thereby rejecting the exclusionary impulses of social Darwinism with its survival of the fittest ideology in an age when concepts of racial difference contributed to the rhetoric of Japanese colonial expansion, as I've suggested. Now, by the time Osaki watched Fleischer's film about evolution, the theory of evolution itself had been circulating in Japan for decades. Right? American academic Edward Morse, his lectures on evolution at Tokyo Imperial University, where he taught for 3 years, beginning in 1877. These lectures are often considered the moment in which Darwin's ideas were formally introduced into Japan. However, what Morse introduced as evolutionary theory was rather a form of social Darwinism that certainly went on to impact political policy and theories of nation and empire building in the coming decades. According to Watanabe Masao, Morse's lectures were, quote, a crude treatment of the subject, in which he applied examples from the animal and plant world indiscriminately to humans, end quote. Now, this abstraction of natural science and its application to the social realm was influential to the fledgling state of the Meiji period, right? The 1868 to 1912, the moment Japan becomes a modern nation state. By the early Showa period, several decades later, when Osaki is writing, this version of social Darwinism was, by and large, the de facto interpretation of evolutionary thinking. But Osaki found something different, something else in evolutionary thought, and indeed in science in general. And we see in her work, plant science abounds. We get a lot of plant science, and moss in particular becomes this meeting point of scientific and poetic speculation. As a primitive plant with no roots, moss was the perfect model for Osaki to craft a new and yet extremely old way of inhabiting a world turned upside down by crisis. Robin Wall Kimmerer says of moss that they are, quote, the most primitive of plants and lack any vascular tissue to hold them upright. But it is precisely this primitive state that has ensured their flourishing. Kimmerer sings the praises of this simplicity and this smallness, arguing that, quote, being small doesn't mean being unsuccessful. Mosses are successful by any biological measure. They inhabit nearly every ecosystem on Earth and number as many as 22,000 species. Beautifully adapted for life in miniature, mosses take full advantage of being small, end quote. And so moss seems to have spoken to Osaki, suggesting a way forward could be found in a movement backwards in evolutionary time toward the small but resilient realm of plant life and moss. In her work's affinity for moss, and indeed plants in general, we see a desire to rethink the human and to better understand that I that Osaki put in brackets in jotting on film. Now, this bracketing of the I is but one example of what we might call a fractured subjectivity in Osaki's writing. But this fracturing was not mere literary conceit for Osaki, as it was for many writers that experimented with the aesthetics of literary modernism in Japan and indeed globally. And this is because Osaki struggled with mental health issues that became the subject of much of her work and ultimately ended her writing career. In 1932, only 1 year after the publication of Wandering in the Realm of the Seventh Sense, she left Tokyo, returned to her native rural Tottori prefecture after suffering from a nervous breakdown. By 1935, she had ceased writing altogether. While she was in Tokyo and active as a writer, political and colonial violence was unfolding all around her. Closer at hand, she struggled to make ends meet. Having to rely on her mother for financial support, Osaki watched as her contemporaries, like the very well-known writer Hayashi Fumiko, gained greater notoriety than she. In 1929, she lost her brother Tetsuro to illness. And this was a family tragedy that some speculate contributed to her worsening psychological condition. Tetsuro had been a student of new Buddhist thought, and scholars have speculated that Osaki was likely introduced to many schools of academic thought, things that we see in her literature, things like evolution, psychology, even vitalism, right? A lot of this probably came through her brother Tetsuro, who passed away. Osaki then lost her oldest brother, Atsuro, to tuberculosis in 1933. Atsuro had served in the Navy until his untimely passing. And so there's this story of Osaki's contemporaries from Women's Arts, this magazine that she contributed her film criticism to, visiting Osaki's apartment, and they said all she did was talk of her grief, right? So this conventional portrait that we have of Osaki Midori is one of struggle, one of sadness, right? This kind of tragic figure. And given Osaki's brief and by all accounts unhappy time spent as a transplant in Tokyo, it's easy to imagine that she certainly felt out of place and uprooted in the colonial metropole. Many of her characters, including the protagonist of Wandering in the Realm of the Seventh Sense, come to the city from a rural elsewhere. And it's plant life, and moss in particular, that allowed Osaki to see the potential in this type of uprooting. Who needs roots? Mosses flourish just fine without roots. And so with moss in mind, Osaki composed an idiosyncratic environmental literature, one that paid close attention to plants and their potential influence on human subjectivity from within the anxious urban setting of Tokyo. In cramped attic rooms and hospital wards, her fractured characters, most of them women, dream of flourishing by forging new connections with the botanical realm, in defiance of their male relatives and the male psychologists who pathologize and hospitalize them. Osaki's work attempts to resist such pathologizing and to instead greet the multiplicity, the fracturing of modern subjectivity as generative rather than debilitating. So this brings me to part 2, meeting moss in evolutionary time. So now I turn to Osaki's best known work, Wandering in the Realm of the Seventh Sense. This is a difficult text to summarize, and it's not because so much happens in the narrative, but rather so little seems to happen. To really appreciate the story, you have to look very closely, as if you were inspecting a clump of moss. For what does happen in the the novella, it's not quite novel length, what does happen happens slowly, nearly imperceptibly, and happens many times, again and again, repetitively. Mostly within one location, this small, cramped house that our protagonist, Machiko, shares with her brothers and cousin. Machiko is a teenage girl of indeterminate age who has bright red curly hair. She uproots, leaves the countryside, comes to Tokyo, and then she comes to live with her 2 brothers, Ichisuke and Niisuke, along with their cousin Sangoro. So we can see this is a story about familial relationships, right? But it's one that ultimately finds Machiko feeling closer to moss as an evolutionary ancestor than to any of her immediate male kin. So each of these four main human characters considers themselves a student, okay? This gets a little out there, so bear with me. Each of them is a student, formally or otherwise, all right? It's a very odd household. It's a haphazard mix of science and art. Sangoro, the cousin, studies music, and so he's trying to retake an entrance exam to a music school that he didn't pass. And so he spends a lot of the novella practicing on an old piano and annoying everyone in the house and his neighbors. Ichisuke, one of Machiko's brothers, is a student of psychology, and he studies this abnormal psychology that gets referred to in the novella as split psychology, right, or bundatsu shiningaku. It's a name that resembles the Japanese word for schizophrenia. It's very close, but it's not exactly the same word. So split psychology is how I will refer to it here. Nisuke, her other brother, conducts research on plants. He's our plant scientist, and he experiments with fertilization throughout the novella, focusing on radishes and moss. Now, the smell of his fertilizer wafts throughout the house, throughout the story. And if you really read it, after a while, you feel like you can smell it as well as you read. But more specifically, what he's doing with his fertilizer is he's trying to study the love life of moss, the love lives of moss. He's mixing different types of fertilizers together to encourage moss to reproduce. And the language that gets used is he's experimenting with their love lives. Machiko, our narrator, our protagonist, considers herself a student of poetry. She tries to capture in poetry, in verse, this illusory sensory experience that she calls the seventh sense, right? And that's where we get the title of the novella. Her project is capturing the seventh sense in poetry. But she's not taken seriously by any of her relatives. She's made to feel small, neglected, and used. As her brothers and cousin hold forth in these long conversations that last for pages on end, Machiko cleans their rooms, she cooks their meals. She's ignored for most of the novella, even though she is the narrator and the protagonist. At one point, she becomes friends with a neighbor, but it's pretty short-lived. At the very end, she leaves the house and visits her brother Ichisuke's clinic. This is the only action in all of the novella that really takes place outside of the house that they share together. So Machiko, she's indoors, she's cleaning, and she's regularly cleaning her brother Nisuke's room, the one who's studying moss. And she marvels at the mosses that spread out like the vastness of a forest on his desk. Okay. I'm going to show a couple stills throughout from a film adaptation of the story. So in her brother's moss that he's researching, Machiko discovers a different world, one that's mysterious and vast, moss-covered landscape. And it's in this world, right, that she finds something that eludes the confining household in which she feels trapped and neglected. As she watches Nisuke working over this forest of moss, Machiko slips into this hazy realm that she calls the seventh sense. And it's here that she becomes botanical. Her senses become augmented, and they start to take on a life of their own. So this is how Machiko describes this. Quote, "On the verge of falling asleep, I breathed heavily. I stayed awake for a short while by breathing in air through my nose, and then I breathed in again. While doing this, I inhabited a singular world of mist. There, my senses worked independently of each other, then merged into one, and then went astray again. My faculties continued incoherently on like this. Nisuke had just finished eagerly rubbing the top of the moss with a cotton swab when his apron became hazy like mist, and transformed into clouds of various shapes, end quote. The new world that opens up to Machiko here as she watches Nisuke work, it's indistinct, incoherent. It's a world where things transform, right? Aprons turn into clouds. This is the seventh sense, a decidedly unclear subjectivity that Machiko describes later, quote, as a mental world shrouded in extensive fog, end quote. In Nozoe Nobuhisa's 2018 manga adaptation of the story, we see the bizarre qualities of this subjective state get really highlighted. We see this insertion of a scene near the end of the story in which Machiko falls asleep and is led by a double of herself directly into this realm of the seventh sense. This is the world you've wanted to know, says the doppelganger Machiko, against this moss-covered landscape that is populated by overlapping repetitions of portals and faces of her male relatives that are growing out of moss spores. Right? I mean, this is a perfect visualization of becoming botanical that we see in the story. It's full of multiplicity, metamorphosis, doubling, right? But this is also the kind of interpretation of what's happening that would require real focus in reading the story, right? If you read through the novella, this is not immediately apparent, right? So I really like this visual adaptation from the manga. Hamano Sachi's 1998 film adaptation depicts this moment a little bit differently. The botanical subjectivity of Machiko is shown by superimposing Machiko's image over a close-up of moss here. So here we see Machiko physically embodying the small potentiality of moss, right, that Kimmerer was talking about. And the exuberance that she feels at having gained this knowledge is legible in this big smile on her face. I know it's a little blurry, but hopefully you can see that she has this giant smile on her face and she's jumping up and down in this moss. So this is a moment of epiphany for Machiko. And what propels this moment is evolutionary thinking. So let me explain. Evolution is introduced into the narrative at the start of one of these very long conversations between her brothers, Ichisuke and Nisuke. Of course, Machiko is quietly, but very closely listening in. Ichisuke, who is the psychologist, the student of psychology, suggests that human emotions such as love are inherited from vegetal ancestors. He says, quote, "Seeing that humans fall in love, there is no reason mosses cannot fall in love. You could say that human love is an inheritance from moss. This perspective is certainly not wrong. The theory of evolution likely imagines moss to be a very distant ancestor of humans," end quote. Ichisuke then goes on to claim that he has actually witnessed humans inhabiting a kind of moss-like subjectivity. Okay? He says, quote, "We can see a kind of evidence of this when humans are on the verge of waking up from a nap and they suddenly find themselves returning to the mind of moss. It's a strange psychology, like clinging to a damp and humid bog, your body unable to move. This is evidence that the disposition of moss has been inherited by humans to this very day," end quote. Now, in this description from her brother Ichisuke, reflecting on his psychiatry studies, right, we see clear echoes of Machiko's own experience watching Nisuke work on moss, right? Machiko drifted off into this misty realm on the verge of sleep, and her senses started working independently of one another, right? Here, Machiko is embodying, in Ichisuke's words, the disposition of moss. So Machiko's becoming botanical, then, is an evolutionary inheritance, and it's one that holds potential for transcendence through this backward movement in evolutionary time. Now, for Ichisuke, her brother, turning backward in evolution in order to embody this kind of moss-like disposition is a pathology, right? This is a serious problem. he complains to his brother Nisuke of a patient who has recently been admitted into his practice. This is what he says of that patient. Quote, "That patient is silent towards me. The split consciousness she possesses is of a completely concealed nature. This is certainly inherited from the disposition of moss in ancient times." End quote. So Ichisuke is concerned about this patient. He recognizes he sees it as a problem. He explains that patients such as this one he's talking about here take on this moss-like subjectivity as a response to feeling uprooted. Okay? He goes on to say, quote, "Those humans that have inherited a moss-like disposition have a craving of wanting to put down roots in one place," end quote. So Ichisuke understands, right, this connection between uprooting of modernity and this desire to become botanical. But for him, right, he diagnoses this as a mental disorder. It's something to be fixed. Importantly, right, there's a gendered element at work here. Part of this conversation that Ichisuke is having with Nisuke revolves around the fact that the patient in question is not male. Otoko de wa nai. Okay? So not female, but not male. It's a very curious phrasing, but in some ways this is a little bit of a critique on Nisuke's part. He's critiquing Ichisuke's history of harboring romantic feelings for his patients. But I want to suggest there's something else going on with this idea, right? Not male, otoko de wa nai. If we consider moss, we can find in this moment and in the story more generally a kind of subversion taking place here, a subversion of sex and gender norms that Osaki is playing with throughout her work and others have written about. But moss brings us to this subversion here. And this is because mosses, and indeed plants in general, really can challenge conventional understandings of sexual differentiation, right? The idea of whether moss can be identified as male or female. So let me explain a little bit. Akiyama Hiroyuki writes in his 2004 book, The Story of Moss, Koke no Hanashi, he writes about how mosses exhibit a very complex biological development, such that some mosses possess male sex organs, some possess female sex organs, right? And we should put these in quotes, while some mosses possess both simultaneously, right? Now in this, they resemble many other species of plant life, okay? But what makes mosses a uniquely complicated species when we try to register some kind of sexual identification that resembles a zoological, right, a mode that resembles what we ascribe to human sexuality, mosses become complicated because of their multiplicity, right? And so this is what Akiyama explains. Quote, "In the case of mosses, they are connected below through their underground stems and their rhizomatic structure, which is a complexly entangled network from which stems do emerge. And so it's difficult to recognize them as individual entities. According to their stages of development and the environment in which they are born and grow, they sometimes only display either male or female sex organs, even though they biologically possess both. And so it can be difficult to judge whether they do, in fact, possess both sexes to begin with," end quote. So the multiplicity of mosses makes it very difficult for us to determine whether they possess male or female sex organs or both, right? This is Akiyama's point. Stella Sanford takes this question of sexual identification in plant life further. In her 2023 book, Vegetal Sex, Sanford interrogates the historical development of botanists ascribing this kind of zoologically analogous notion of sex onto plant life. And she points out that historically, right, philosophers who have been concerned with plants, people like Aristotle, for example, really didn't entertain the idea of male and female plant life. This is Sanford's point, quote, "The idea of plant sex was not obvious to these thinkers because in answer to the question, do plants have male and female, required an answer to another, more fundamental question. What are male and female? End quote. And so Sanford argues that plants can lead us to this fundamental question, in part because plants, and plants alone, exhibit a dibionic life cycle. Okay, this is a complicated term, I'll do my best, right? This means that, according to Sanford, plants have, quote, two different multicellular stages where one generation of organism has a singular set of chromosomes, right? In the other, it has a double set of chromosomes. Now, what this means for Sanford is, quote, although there are two generations in the individual plant life cycle, okay, already this is blowing up the way we think about an individual life, right? There are at least three plants, one sporophyte and two gametophytes, one male and one female. The dibionic life cycle thus further troubles the idea of the individual organism characteristic of the zoocentric model. Okay, so this idea of a dibionic life cycle, and here we have a diagram of a life cycle of a typical moss. I don't pretend to understand this. I don't expect any of you to understand this, and that's the point, right? That's the point. This is the life cycle. You can see how complex this is, right? How radically different this is if we want to think about individuality, about sex, extrapolating that to gender, right? All of these get really troubled in Sanford's terms. And so this type of life cycle pushes against, right, these clear notions of male-female, and it presents a radical reformulation of the plant as a multiplicity, right? So my question is, to what extent is Ichisuke's patient striving towards this type of sexual and subjective multiplicity by becoming botanical and adopting a moss-like disposition? Given that Niisuke's primary research is on moss reproduction, right? We remember that he's studying the love lives of moss. And if we further understand that there's this historical reality in which the dibionic life cycle, this unique form of life, was first identified in 1851 through the study of moss, as well as ferns, then this question of sex and gender and the subversion and rethinking thereof becomes inseparable from the botanical imagination that we find in Wandering in the Realm of the Seventh Sense. And it is also tied to the history of evolutionary thought, as Darwin himself expressed uncertainty about this distinction between male and female in plant life in this 1877 book, The Different Forms of Flowers on Plants of the Same Species. So it's perhaps for this reason that Niisuke, right, the researcher of plant biology, he finds this moss-like disposition that his brother, the psychologist, is complaining about, he finds it quite natural. Okay, so in his response to his brother Ichisuke, Niisuke actually posits a certain kind of agency in the patient's psychological state. He claims that his brother's patient has performed a species reversal, shugaeri, and recounts a story that he has heard of someone being born with a fox's tail. Quote, they said it was a case of humans going against the course of evolution. In addition to human species reversing back to foxes, it's also not a problem for human psychology to return to that of moss, says Niisuke. Of course, Niisuke doesn't know, or more likely doesn't care, that his own sister is attempting a species reversal of her own. And so while Niisuke's research on moss allows him to see a certain degree of agency in species reversal, it's only Machiko who can glimpse the full potential of becoming botanical. It's Machiko who names the botanical subjectivity that is arrived at through this species reversal the seventh sense. Right? This is the name she gives it. And while she repeatedly fails to capture it in poetry, it does give her a momentary means of escape, however brief, from the confines of her family and the home that they share. And so there's one particularly charged scene where Machiko brings her brothers boiled chestnuts that have arrived from their grandmother. Niisuke is, of course, hard at work on his moss research, and he's focusing on the pollen that has started to appear. And this serves, within the logic of the story, as a telltale sign that his moss has indeed fallen in love. So bits of chestnut fall from Niisuke's mouth as he's chewing. And it falls onto a notebook that's sitting right next to the moss with the pollen on it. And Machiko, because she pays close attention, notices the striking resemblance between the moss pollen and the chestnut powder. And here she starts to become botanical. Quote, "Without thinking, I craned my neck and looked at the surface of the notebook. Then I knew. The moss pollen and the chestnut bits, they were the exact same color, and they had the same shape. And so I felt as if I had gained a vague but remarkable piece of knowledge. The poetic realm I was searching for, wasn't it this small world of powder? Moss flowers and the inside of chestnuts, now scattered atop the notebook. Beside this are the tips of tweezers, the thin roots of moss, and the shadow of the perfume bottle under the electric light turned into a single beam of yellow light stretching toward the cotton swab." End quote. There's an excitement to Machiko's narration here. We get this very uncharacteristic use of exclamation points, the only time this appears in the novella. This is a moment of exuberance, small but exuberant. It's possibility born of the seventh sense. Right? It's this pure possibility of becoming botanical within the small world of moss and powder, a world of smallness that Robin Wall Kimmerer extols as she writes of mosses, quote, "taking possession of spaces from which other plants are excluded by their size." Right? Their way of being are a celebration of smallness. In being small, limitation is their strength. End quote. So Machiko, who has been ignored, consistently made to feel small by her male relatives, she arrives at this momentary recognition of smallness as a form of strength in this way. Unfortunately, the moment ends quickly. Her brother, who remains oblivious to the insight that Machiko has gained, sweeps the possibility of becoming a botanical away in an instant, as he, quote, "gathered the moss up in a hurry and brushed the chestnut bits from the notebook." End quote. So it's only for a moment that Machiko finds a sense of escape in the mistiness of the moss forest before she is once again held back by one of her relatives. The transcendent world of evolutionary kin gives way to the confining world of patriarchal relationships. Perhaps this was inevitable. Right, for this near utopian vision of evolutionary thought that Machiko finds in the seventh sense runs counter to the prevailing political adherence to social Darwinism in the early Showa era. Historians like Tessa Morris Suzuki has demonstrated, right, how evolutionary thought reinforced ideologies of racial purity, supremacy, within Japan to justify imperial expansion, and how even less overtly racist theories of cultural evolution still spurred on the creation of the greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. So Osaki's idiosyncratic take on evolution was an attempt to rethink evolution as multi-directional. You could move forwards, you could move backwards. It denied the notion that evolution unfolded in an ever-progressing path. It's not an outright condemnation of Japanese imperialism, but there is nevertheless a form of botanical resistance to be found in the novella's turn back in evolutionary time. This is especially true when we consider the gender dynamics, right, under which Osaki's female characters attempt their species reversal. Again, they become moss-like in defiance of this patriarchal scientific system that looks to pathologize them. So there's a lot to celebrate in Machiko's short epiphany about the utopian possibilities held in this move to a moss-like disposition. But the moss in question is still the subject of scientific experimentation, and it is precisely Niisuke's scientific work that places this novella within Japan's colonial nexus. And so if we move moss even further into the foreground, we can see how the small, seemingly sheltered home that was shared by Machiko and her brothers still belonged to a world at war. And how even the moss that brought Machiko into a moment of transcendence was fertilized by the spoils of colonial extraction. Which brings me to part 3 of fertilizer, war, and love. So by and large, critics have read this novella, Wandering in the Realm of the Seventh Sense, and the place of the science within it, within the context of ero-guro nonsense, or erotic, grotesque nonsense. This is a cultural aesthetic term that was used contemporaneously in the 1930s, as well as retrospectively. This is Miriam Silverberg's really wonderful book about the term. The idea here is that ero-guro nonsense, it's an aesthetic term that characterizes Japanese modernism as a decadent movement, right? One that was much more concerned with sensual pleasure, oddities, the bizarre, right? It was much more interested in those kind of concerns than in the increasingly unstable politics of the early Showa era, right? So ero-guro nonsense is kind of a reactionary understanding of this work as turning away from politics in an increasingly violent time. This is how Osaki's work has largely been read, and again, in particular, the science in it in this way. Now, what this does is it discounts Osaki's engagement with science to a certain degree, and in particular, her engagement with botanical science, and renders it either parody or a form of nonsense. And one can partly trace this tendency to read Osaki's work in this way to the story's republication in the 1960s in this volume called Dark Humor or Black Humor. This is from 1969, where Osaki gets republished. So if we think of Wandering in the Realm of the Seventh Sense as an example of dark humor, the seemingly anthropomorphic qualities of Osaki's moss, right, the fact that they fall in love, we can understand this as a kind of grotesqueness, right? This is because within the paradigm of ero-guro nonsense, guro, the grotesque, often referred to acts of sexual perversion, right? And so on the surface, Osaki's sexually active moss fits this designation. But I've been trying to suggest throughout my talk today that there's something else going on here. And the violence of Japan's colonial project serves as an important but largely neglected background for our reading of Wandering in the Realm of the Seventh Sense. But if we take moss seriously, right, and we take Osaki's moss seriously, and we don't explain it away as an example of grotesque parody, right, what this does is it allows us to open a new window onto this historical moment from which the story emerged. And it helps us identify, I think, this ambient anxiety that hovers throughout the narrative. The novella's portrayal of plant research, as unscientific as it may appear, is tied directly to Japan's colonial project and, in turn, to Osaki's own family history. This was because Osaki had several family members that were living in Japanese-occupied territories. Her great-uncle was living in Taiwan. Her sister lived in Manchuria. And here's where the connection to the story comes in, is that her her third oldest brother, Shiro, was an agricultural researcher at Tokyo Imperial University. Ultimately, he was deployed to colonial Korea and participated in the creation of governmental policies surrounding fertilizer use on the Korean peninsula. Osaki visited him numerous times in what was then the capital city of Keijo, right, modern-day Seoul. So in December of 1930, this is 6 months after Osaki watched the film Evolution, and only 3 months before she published Wandering in the Realm of the Seventh Sense, her brother Shiro published an article titled Supply and Demand of Fertilizer and Its Management in Chosen. This is a magazine that was published by the Colonial Government General of Korea. Okay, he's kind of right in the middle there. So, as other scholars have pointed out, it seems clear that Shiro's research served as the model for Nisuke, right, and Nisuke's research on moss. And if we really take this seriously and keep it in mind, the novel takes on a new sort of dark aura when we read it. Now, obviously, the uprooting experienced in Japan's colonies was of an entirely different magnitude than the one experienced by those occupying the metropole. Agricultural reforms on the Korean peninsula, initiated by the Japanese colonial government, displaced farmers, denied them access to fertilizers that were necessary to their livelihoods. Such restrictions often resulted in violence. So in the same year that Shiro wrote of fertilizer management, local farmers battled with police in Gangwon province over access to fertilizer and other necessities. In that particular incident, 4 people were killed, 26 were injured. Fertilizer played a very significant role in Japan's colonial project, and here I'm drawing from Fujihara Tatsushi's 2017 book, War in Agriculture, which is a fantastic book. As Fujihara explains in this work, the development of chemical fertilizer was intimately tied to the war project. The ammonia produced for fertilizer was likewise used in the production of gunpowder. Fujihara writes of how Chiso and Showa Denko, and these are 2 companies that developed chemical fertilizers at the time, manufactured gunpowder in large quantities, and how, for such purposes, Chiso, and some of you might know Chiso best for the polluting of the Minamata Bay and the subsequent methylmercury poisoning that afflicted residents in the post-war period. There's a much longer history to Chiso outside of Minamata. Insofar as Chiso established a factory in what is now the North Korean city of Hungnam, and I believe this was the largest industrial chemical factory in the world at this point. So, but both companies constructed hydroelectric plants that eroded mountains, lowered water levels in colonial Korea, again, to produce large amounts of gunpowder and fertilizer. Now, around the time that Osaki is writing Wandering in the Realm of the Seventh Sense, proletarian writers in Japanese-occupied Korea were creating literary responses to the establishment of this factory. And those stories viscerally demonstrate the exploitation of local workers and the overall crisis of colonial extraction. And it's this crisis, diffuse as it may be for Machiko and her brothers, that wafts through the air of the house they share in Tokyo. This is because Wandering in the Realm of the Seventh Sense mentions the smell of ammonia as Nisuke boils his fertilizer. It speaks of a yellow liquid that Nisuke uses to fertilize his plants, making it clear that his research concerns chemical fertilizer in addition to the organic fertilizer that he boils in ceramic pots. This subtle, amorphous atmosphere of crisis literally drifts through the narrative, and its violent undercurrent occasionally bubbles up to the surface in very odd gendered ways. At one point, cousin Sangoro throws Machiko out of a window. Later on, he cuts her hair against her will. As Sangoro ignores Machiko's tears and cuts her hair into a short bob, Machiko relates the violation that she feels to that of being stripped naked. She says, quote, "My neck was suddenly cold, the unmistakable feeling of having my body fully exposed," end quote. So again, obviously not commensurate with the real-world violence that's experienced in Japan's colonies, but such moments in Osaki's fiction take on this uncanny hue of colonial domination, forced assimilation, when they are read against her own familial connection to colonial Korea and subsequent awareness of botanical science's place within Japanese imperialism. Especially when we consider the rather negative portrayal of these male figures in the story. So this element, its connection to Japan's colonial nexus, becomes more apparent when we focus on moss. But taking the moss seriously also shows us the extent to which Niisuke's research was very much directly engaged with scientific theories of evolution that circulated throughout Japan in the 20th century, right? So this is, we see this if we look at the work of Oka Asajiro. Oka is the author of a best-selling treatise on evolution that was published in 1904 called Discourse on Evolution. And in this work, Discourse on Biology, we see that one of the chapters in this work from 1916, very much a scientific text, one of the chapters is called Love, Nenai, love. For Oka, talk of love was not anthropomorphic when applied to plant life. Instead, it was an operative concept within the scientific study of biology. So he begins his chapter in this volume by saying this, quote, "There are various methods for sperm and egg to meet, and for this reason, breeding animals are equipped with a variety of organs. However, the mere arrangement of equipment has no effect in and of itself. There must also be an extremely strong instinct that derives no satisfaction if this equipment is not put to use. This is the root of what is called love in our world," end quote. Now, Oka uses the word love to name this kind of instinctual drive that leads both animals and plants to reproduce. He goes on, quote, "As all animals and plants carry out sexual reproduction, there is necessarily a strong love between each egg and sperm cell," end quote. Now, in relegating the concept of love to this instinctual drive at the cellular level, Oka is minimizing the differences between human, plant, and more than human animal, just as Osaki is also doing in her writing, I would argue. For both Osaki, the poet, the fiction writer, and Oka, the serious scientist, right? For both of them, love leveled this hierarchical playing field of evolution in what is another strike against the logic of social Darwinism, I would say. Now, in wandering in the realm of the seventh sense, at the very end, we see Machiko falling in love with one of Ichisuke's colleagues. The suggestion is that Niisuke's experiments with making moss fall in love, right, the smell of the fertilizer that could very well be coming from colonial Korea, it's making the moss fall in love. It ultimately affects Machiko as well. And so far from a story of anthropomorphism, we could say that Machiko's falling in love in the end of the story is in fact phytomorphic. It ascribes plant-like qualities to humans rather than the other way around. If love is an inheritance from moss, Machiko is becoming botanical, becoming moss-like by falling in love. Now, interestingly, Oka Asajiro, the scientist, was also particularly fascinated by moss. And he too saw something like a revolutionary potential in its multiplicity. Gregory Sullivan, in his monograph on Oka, recounts how Oka wrote an article in 1907 about so-called kokemushi. These are aquatic invertebrates commonly referred to as moss animals in English, although the Japanese name literally translates to moss insects. For Oka, moss animals were an ideal form of life, a collective body that is constituted by a multiplicity of individuals. And he advocated that it was in the best interest of the Japanese nation near the turn of the 20th century to, quote, recast human nature and eliminate our selfishness in order to become like moss animals, end quote. He even went as far to suggest that if put on public display, statues of moss animals would have a better effect on teaching public morality than statues of religious or political figures. So serious science, it seems, can be just as steeped in the bizarre logic of eroguro nonsense, right, as the aesthetics of literary modernism. Which brings me to my conclusion. Just checking on the time. Okay, I think we're pretty good. My conclusion is botanical rebirth. So Osaki Midori yearned for change. Right? And she recognized the plasticity of subjectivity and strove for transformation in the face of an everyday that was eaten away by a slowly unfolding catastrophe. In the in-between of literature and science, she attempted to forge something new, to transcend the limits of both modern subjectivity and genre. And so critics have read the novella as exceptional and out of time, right? Out of step with its time. But I've been trying to suggest that Osaki is very much of her time. And indeed, she would go on to outlive the Showa era, even though she retired from writing, and be rediscovered in the 1960s and would influence the next generation of writers, as well as film and media scholars. So as I mentioned, she retired from writing in 1935, and a very prominent literary critic and media critic, Haneda Kyoteru, has this to say about Osaki in 1973. So he's imagining her post-retirement. He says, quote, "It is said that the female author who suffers from a nervous disorder was at her family's urging forced to return to her native Tottori. After moving from hospital to hospital, last year she shut herself away in a room in her sister's home, spending her afternoons working diligently on small projects at home and her nights absorbed in the novels of Shishi Bunroku and Kitamorio. This is not a romantic end to the life of a genius." End quote. So we see a deep respect for Osaki here. Right? And we can feel the sadness that Haneda feels as he imagines Osaki locked away, possibly against her will, with nothing but a few novels to read. But it's possible, I think, to reframe Osaki's retirement and her quiet final years as a kind of becoming botanical. My question is, to what extent is Haneda playing the role of Ichisuke here? Pathologizing Osaki's silence as a fracture, as a deviation, a pathology, right? Something that should not befall a genius. The last lines of Osaki's 1929 short story Osmanthus says this: "I am a destitute moss that has begun to wither." This is a rather famous quote from Osaki, and we can question, did Osaki here predict her own eventual retreat from the world? Or, if we want to give this a plant humanities reading, can we say that she became botanical in this moment and instead blazed a path towards something new? Now again, if we pay closer attention to plants, we can see that even in this, the most dire of sentences, we can see something full of potential here. And this is because, according to bryologist Arakawa Tomotsugu, quote, "Usually, dried up moss has the image of something transient and broken. When moss dries out, it becomes frizzled. However, if given water, within moments it will suck it up and come back to life," end quote. Robin Wall Kimmerer likewise claims that, quote, "Most mosses are immune to death by drying. For them, desiccation is simply a temporary interruption in life," end quote. Nearly 30 years after Osaki passed away in 1971, Hamano Sachi would interweave, the filmmaker Hamano Sachi would interweave Osaki's life story with the fictional narrative of Machiko in Wandering in the Realm of the Seventh Sense into a film. So it's a half biopic, half adaptation of Wandering in the Realm of the Seventh Sense. This cinematic portrait unfolds like a botanical rebirth. So while the narrative of Wandering in the Realm of the Seventh Sense progresses linearly, right, it follows the narrative of the story in a linear progression, the biographical portions move backwards in time, presenting Osaki's death first, and then ending with a young Osaki surrounded by friends overlooking the ocean from Tottori's vast sand dunes. As the on-screen Machiko lingers over the small world of moss, yearning to become botanical, the filmic Osaki springs back to life like a withered moss given water. As the screen goes dark and the film fades into silence as Osaki looks out over the water, one can imagine the reverse flow of time continuing on. until Osaki becomes a chameleon, becomes moss, becomes a slice of glacier, becomes smoke, becomes a star, becomes gas, and on and on. Thank you. I apologize. I think I went a little over time.
Thank you so much for that wonderful talk. I just offer a few reflections prior to opening it up to the audience. So I'll just begin. So Jon Pitt's Becoming Botanical engages and illuminates the botanicality that inhabits modern Japanese literature and media. Here I'm talking about the book more generally. Pitt traces the phytomorphic preoccupations of a series of Japanese texts, literary, scientific, and filmic, revealing how a turn to plant life may allow humans to reconfigure their own relationships to time and space, to survival and endurance, to poetic production and social reproduction. As a reader who does not specialize in Japanese literature, I'm particularly humbled to be among you. I'm struck by the extraordinary care and intellectual generosity with which Pitt approaches his corpus, so that as it proceeds, the book allows the text under analysis to take on ever more expansive and enticing forms. Rather than flattening the works that he studies by reducing them to illustrations of his argument, for instance, Pitt renders them increasingly subtle and appealing, deploying his expertise in a way that opens up new critical vistas for specialists and non-specialists alike. This knack for ever vitalizing analysis is on display in Pitt's talk today, as we've seen, drawn from his chapter on the work of author, poet, and critic Osaki Midori. As we just have learned, Pitt notices a seemingly small detail that tracks across Osaki's biography, her film criticism, and her literary writing, namely her interest in moss. Of course, moss itself is easy to overlook, and the same could surely be said of Osaki's own preoccupation with it, a seemingly minor instance of botanical investment that may not on its own seem especially exciting. But Pitt makes of Osaki's multiple, yet also glancing engagements with moss something resonant, pleasure-inducing, unsettling, meaningful. Taken together and within Pitt's analysis, these tiny mentions of a small being morph into encounters with history, with intersubjectivity, with the very stuff of which life seems to be made. In this way, the plunge into moss, the noticing of the plant in its often silent, seemingly insignificant specificity, becomes a plunge into a mind and consciousness altering state, a movement backwards in evolutionary time, as Pitt himself puts it, that calls into question the wholeness and integrity of the human subject. Alighting upon the moss, Osaki, much like her fictional heroine, Machiko, cultivates a spirit of defiance of the fictions of modern selfhood, emerging from within patriarchal structures of the family and the uneasy navigation and erasure of colonial histories that both alienate and subjugate her. Pitt is clear about the ways in which the dream of becoming botanical in Osaki's work is linked to a utopian imaginary that is itself shaped by the strange but generative compulsions of a mossy desire, both human and plant-like all at once. In the conclusion to the talk, he has evoked the specific botanical being of moss itself, its ability to reanimate itself when given water, for instance, to emerge from a seeming state of torpor into a full and vibrant life, in order, as he does, to movingly breathe life and vitality back into Osaki's biography and oeuvre, too often consigned to a state of sadness on the one hand, or to a decadent experiment in generic imagination on the other. In Pitt's reading, the moss then has a doubly utopian function. On the one hand, it serves as a model for a subjectivity that is beyond or before gender, beneath or beyond selfhood, distilling and dissolving in the face of patriarchal domination, evading joyfully, and thus blazing delightedly, a path to another strange world that is still, in some sense, the author's own. But on the other hand, moss itself becomes not just the illustration of a utopian condition, but its own utopian technique, for generating and cultivating life in places where it might not otherwise be found. A bringer of vibrancy and force to the sadness of a so-called minor life in retreat, a conveyor of new meaning, sense, and power to texts that might appear in many ways too small. Moss is at work in both these instances as a kind of paradigmatic figure and as an instrument of transformation. Yet Pitt also reveals another side of the life of the plant, not just its power, but its vulnerability, not just its implication in a potential for individual and collective transformation, but its involvement in a history of colonial and imperial violence. The plant is not only the subject of fantasy and the surprising, because small and unobtrusive, agent of change, it is also the object of experimentation and exploitation, most specifically within an agricultural context that is deeply linked to the exercise of imperial power. In this context, the smallness, fragility, and most of all, malleability of plant life, not moss specifically here, but all plant life, becomes linked both figuratively and literally to the oppression, displacement, and manipulation of human bodies. Plants figure and operate in the realm of both human life and human death. Their changeability allows them to take on a double-sided, or rather multiple, function, and they slide as easily into a colonial biopolitics, where extractivist practice and agricultural procedures are at the very center, as they do into a utopian politics. Thus, the ascription of plant-like qualities to humans can be as much a horror as it is a delight. Pitt excavates this dualness of the plant, its ontological, epistemological, and aesthetic flexibility from Osaki's novella, just as he reveals how history itself depends upon the ability of the plant to function simultaneously as the most vulnerable of bodies to extractivist schemes, a vulnerability that is then terrifyingly mapped onto humans themselves, and as a powerful figure of resistance. In its malleability, its manipulability as an engine of both anxiety and pleasure, the plant seems to have a deep and abiding connection to another mechanism that strikes humans as both uncanny and exciting, namely the mechanism of sex. Pitt shows how the position of the plant in early 20th century evolutionary science, as in Osaki's novel, places it always in the ambit of love and desire. While moss does not reproduce in the way that humans do, as we've seen, right, it seems to figure, in both cases, the remarkable potency, power, and once again, changeability of desire itself, which becomes a force that appears to inhere in bodies in order both to organize and to reconfigure them. And I think we can see actually Linnaeus making the same argument around plant life as an instance of the forcefulness and inherence of desire. Here too, rather than the human providing the example that the plant must somehow follow, according to an anthropomorphic logic, it is the vegetal being that provides the key instances of the workings of desire itself, its necessity, its urgency, and crucially, its ability to cut across or flow over different bodily or anatomical arrangements. In its very sexlessness, I'm using that word consciously, which is also an absence of gender, at least according to a human vantage, moss then seems to exist as the most perfect, indeed the most pure, and I'm putting that in quotes, drawing it from your text too, where you put it in quotes, indeed the most pure instantiation of desire, an instance of the way in which nature might seek to distill the drive to reproduce, in fact, to love, one that depends on no particular bodily configuration, that exists even in the absence of body, of self, of subject, conventionally understood. At the same time, it is this seemingly innate and perhaps universal mechanism, the operation of desire that moves through humans and plants alike, that makes both humans and plants susceptible to biopolitical management. If desire is both ever present and ever transient, perhaps it can still be harnessed, manipulated, managed, deployed, cultivated for culture's sake. It is in this moment that the utopian imaginary and the agricultural practice or procedure become one. Perhaps suffice it to say that the non-presence of human sexuality, or gender in human terms, does not mean that desire has escaped or evaded the projects of biopolitical control. On the contrary, the malleability of the plant, its capacity to signal and to transmit, I quote Pitt, quoting Oga, what is called love in this world, represents its greatest extractive resource. In leveling the hierarchical playing field of evolution, as Pitt puts it, are plants necessarily striking a blow against a capitalist system that seeks to put desire to work? For after all, it is in plants that desire seems to work best of all. As Pitt shows with such dexterity and interest, in the writing of Osaki, but also in the field of literary studies more generally, plants and texts have something in common. And not just because plants are fascinating texts in and of themselves, as we've seen, offering themselves with seemingly infinite generosity to analysis, interpretation, review, and reclamation. We find in plants, as we do in literary texts, an almost impossibly various experimentation with desire itself, its stimulation, its evocation, its manipulation, its recreation. If the slipping into a state of mossiness in Osaki's novella is a kind of enhancing of desire, an augmentation of the senses that allows for a new, strange, and I love the word exuberant relationship to the body, this slippage is also one in which the literary work itself delights, or seems to. The novella passes from hand to hand, from reader to reader, as its own embodiment of what Pitt and Kimmerer beautifully refer to as a small potentiality. But if plants and texts have something in common, it is not just their smallness, and in our own ruined world, their seeming insignificance at first glance, the way they close in upon themselves, presenting an outside that is both inviting and repulsive, compelling us to go beyond or beneath. It is also because they are both diversely and near infinitely mobilizable, moving across periods, cultures, geographies, states of being and becoming, both recognizable and profoundly weird. Pitt shows us why a turn to the plants is not simply yet another new way to think about or approach literary texts, the latest in a long series of turns that never quite arrive at a revolution. Instead, he reveals the deep and abiding sympathy between plant being and art in the particular contexts that interest him, those of Japanese media in the long 20th century. Most fascinatingly, he does so with an attention to both the delightful and the devastating effects of this sympathy, its working in contexts that it both amplifies and shifts. As Pitt has shown us today, in the connection to language and to plants, to the language of the plants, we long to morph and to become in ways that both galvanize and destroy us. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. We'll move into the more public segment of the Q&A session. I'm going to just remind people who are dialing in from elsewhere, you can use the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom screen to pose a question, make a comment for the speaker. I have a little list that is developing here, but I think probably first I can just start with someone who is here in the room with us. Is there someone who would like to ask the opening question? Anyone else? Baker, yes, please.
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting text, and I love seeing these connections between women and becoming plants in so many different texts. I think that one thing that was really interesting to me is the multiplicity of loss in connection to like her perceived loneliness at the end of her life.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering if, you know, her want and movement to become moss in some ways is aiding with like her own multiplicity as a person, and like within that selfhood and multiplicity of Osaki Osaki, she is kind of not alone, and that she has herself in many like facets. So I'm wondering if that connection that you see is between her character and her in becoming Moss, if that kind of relation to her perceived loneliness, if you see like a connection.
Yeah, thank you so much for the question. This is one of those things where when we teach literature, right, we push so hard against like biographical readings of texts, right? But I think this is a good example of where Osaki's own life really is filtered into her work. And like a lot of the writers that I talk about, that biographical side of their fiction gets filtered through plant life, right? So plants become a way for them to sort of comment on their own lives and desires, struggles, right? But it's always filtered through this plant figure, right? Earlier I was talking, you were in the room, about Ito Hiromi, right? Hiromi Ito, who is also somebody who writes in a very seemingly autobiographical vein, right? But is exploring those moments through plant life. So Osaki, as I mentioned, is someone who definitely struggled with, kinds of mental, struggles that is very much, if you look at biographies of her work, like that's what people really focus on, right? She was tortured, she may have struggled with medication, right? Addiction to certain medications. These are all things that pop up in some of her other works. We see characters that do seem what today we would call, addicted to certain forms of medicine. And so we can apply that biographical reading to her work, but again, I find it so fascinating that once we think about how the plants are working, then the way she's thinking about her loneliness might be very different, right? The loneliness or this shinkeibyo, right? Like this anxiety disorder that she's struggling with. Plants are a way for her to think about this as generative. There's one of her other stories, Miss Cricket or Cricket Girl, depending how it's translated. And I will actually just plug this if anybody's interested. There are David Boyd and Asayone Yama, I believe, are working on a new translation of Osaki's work that hopefully will be coming out within the next couple of years. So I'm very excited for that. But Miss Cricket, Cricket Girl, in that story, there's this really fascinating part where they talk about how certain characters are trying not to breathe in the scent of certain trees because those trees suffer from nervous disorder, and if the humans breathe it in, then they will likewise suffer from nervous disorder, right? And so there is this, again, it's sort of a utopian, but it's a utopian like remapping of kinship and community that extends to the plant world. And yeah, that notion of fracturing and anxiety, like all that ties them together. So absolutely, right? That's what I'm trying to gesture at towards the end there, that Hanada Kyoteru, who is, brilliant theorist, somebody who really championed Osaki, calls her his muse at one point, right? But he still can't get past this pathologizing her of a tragic end. But you're right, there are other ways to think about that in a mossy way, right, that is about community and is not about loneliness and solitude, but something else in solitude, perhaps. So, yeah, thank you.
All right, let's move to the first question from our global audience. Can you comment on the relationship between Osaki's work and Taisho Seimei Shugi?
Yeah, so Seimei Shugi, so vitalism is a really fascinating moment the sort of theories of vitalism that are circulating Japan at the time in the Taisho period. So a little bit, before Osaki's writing, kind of the tail end when she starts writing. I do think there's a lot to say there. I don't see anything explicitly mentioned in her work. She doesn't, that I've come across, she's not really talking about seimei shugi all that much, but I do think that's part of the intellectual milieu, right? And so certainly her brother, who passed away, who introduced her to a lot of things, that's one of the things that other scholars have written about. They suspect that vitalism was something that he introduced her to. So I do think she's thinking about this notion of vitalism to a certain extent, but it's not as explicit, perhaps, as we might think, given her interest in science more broadly. Evolution, biology, as much as like vitalism was sort of a part of that movement, I don't think, some of the trappings of vitalism that we find, right, the eugenicist sort of tendencies and the things that vitalism often gets very criticized for, I don't see that as much in Osaki's work. But it's a great question, and it's something, I should definitely think more about. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Hello, first off, and yes, just thank you just for the talk. And I'll be quite honest and mention that I have not quite read Osaki's work, but just as someone kind of in Japanese studies, it's just very fascinating for me to learn about. I guess one thing I was curious about is I also know that like Moss is referenced in like the Imperial National Anthem.
Sure is.
Yeah, and I was wondering if like what if you had made anything of that connection between this work and the anthem in terms of like the Emperor Louis None until like the moss grows on all the stones, and whether you'd taken that or just how you contextualized both together.
Yeah, that's something that I've written into this chapter and kind of taken out, right? Because it seems very obvious to a certain degree, right? For those that are familiar with Japan, right, and are thinking about imperial politics. So the Japanese national anthem, Kimi ga Yo, right, it ends on this image of moss, growing on the boulder that grows from tiny rocks, right? So moss is very much tied to images of the imperial house, right? How much I want to do with that, it certainly plays into the fact that maybe she's pushing against that, right, to a certain degree. But it also just seemed like such an obvious reference that maybe I didn't need to make it. But again, my work, I'm always trying to speak to people outside of Japanese studies at the same time, right? And Professor Meeker's very generous comments, I'm always heartened by the fact that this work can speak to someone who either hasn't read the work or is not familiar with Japanese studies as well. So it's a good reminder, right, that some of these things that maybe seem obvious disciplinarily, when you're trying to speak outside of that discipline, it's a good thing to mention it. But absolutely, right, I think there's probably no way in this moment of, emperor, the cult of the emperor just growing with the expansion of imperial Japan, moss doesn't at least ring a little true, right, with the national anthem. So, yeah. So thank you for that. It's a good reminder that would be something to kind of foreground. Yeah.
Okay, here's another one from our larger audience. This is a short question.
Short question? Okay.
How about trans moss?
How about trans moss? Yeah, I think moss, plants in general, there's so many interesting projects, people working on queer ecologies, right? Queer plant studies. Absolutely, right? I think this work, Osaki's somebody who has been taken up within queer theory on the Japanese side to a certain degree. I think there's a lot more potential for that, as plants in general. This is something I really try to. What I try to get my undergraduates in particular excited about plant studies, right? The things they're thinking about, social justice, issues of gender, sexuality, immigration, right? Things that, especially for those of us living in Southern California, right, are the things that matter to our students. Plants are not an escape from that, right? Plants can bring us to that in very interesting ways, right? So absolutely, trans moss. I mean, if that's somebody's way into conceptualizing, trans identity. Now, I want to be careful not to suggest that, trans identity is something that is necessarily operative in Osaki's time, right? I mean, this is a historically sort of contingent emergence and a formulation of identity. Osaki would not be somebody who would have the kind of language to discuss trans identity, but there is a queer potentiality in her work, absolutely. And Moss, I think, helps us, go there. So yeah, I'm all for that. And, I think this is, if we want to think about how to queer a text, right, how to queer even canonical readings of Japanese literature, right, read around these dominant paradigms of gender and sexuality and the kind of patriarchal, masculine history that looms over the Japanese literary canon, plants kind of give us a little crack, right? They're ways to read around some of those power structures. And so, yeah, trans moss, absolutely. Yeah.
This is in reference to, I think, an excerpt from that Professor Meeker read in her discussion from your work, talking about like some shared characteristic between humans and plants of this like innate sense of desire
Yeah.
as a motivating force, and the ability to tap into that for what she called, and I guess from your work, biopolitical manipulation.
Sure.
And it reminded me of just like some of my own experience with ideas of a land management strategy called biodynamic. It's like a certification, but it kind of combines certain more regenerative, sustainable land practices with like spiritual and astrological techniques
Yeah.
to really tap into forces that encourage improving ecological, soil health, and food, nutrition, and like whole hosts of benefits.
Yeah. I know mostly of it through wine, right? Biodynamic wine is
Yeah.
a very big thing, yeah.
Right, and there's I visited a ranch in Colorado with this guy who has like some of the most insane like scientific soil data in the country using these practices, like uncharted improvements in soil health and other metrics. So I'm just curious if you could speak more about that and yeah, just like talk more about what you're exactly referring to as I'm forgetting that terminology, but biopolitical manipulation.
Sure, yeah, I mean, biopolitics, this is a very dominant way of analyzing texts within the humanities, right? So a lot of this comes through Foucault, right? And thinking about the manipulation and the control of the human body as a means of power, right? One of the things that critical plant studies has kind of introduced, and a lot of this comes through Neelan's book, which is plant theory, is thinking, well, how do plants trouble the way we in the humanities conventionally think about biopower, right? And so I think and I don't want to speak for Professor Meeker, right? But that's sort of, I think, what we're getting at is modes of control, right? And the way that the very material body and notion of life, right, is potentially manipulated to serve the state to certain ends, right? How does that differ when we look at plants? How does it look similar, right? there's very interesting ways. Again, earlier you were in the conversation earlier where we looked at this idea of the language of native plants versus invasive plants versus naturalized plants, right? So biopolitics, right, biopolitical manipulation in a conventional sense would look at how human bodies are governed, right, within notions of immigration. Who is deemed native to a place, who is deemed invasive, right? But we have the same kind of language for plants. And how do those things kind of track against each other, right? Yeah, biodynamic farming is really interesting, right? Because there is an almost like spiritual level to it as well, right? And yeah, I mean, there's a lot of interesting questions about what does agriculture look like outside of control, right? I mean, are those necessarily, like, is agriculture always already a kind of mode of biopolitical control, right? There's a Japanese farmer who's become quite well known for trying to have a very natural form of farming, right? So Fukuoka Masanobu, he's got a book that's been translated in English called The One Straw Revolution. And his philosophy, and this is a very much a sort of Buddhist-informed philosophy, was about non-intervention farming, agriculture. Letting things grow as they grow, just zero human manipulation. I can't speak to the effectiveness of his practice, but his writing is really fascinating, right? And so that's an example of where maybe we see somebody thinking about trying to prevent a biopolitical or botanical biopolitical intervention, right? Trying to resist that to a certain degree. But yeah, biodynamic farming is another interesting way to think about that. So yeah.
It seemed in your discussion like you didn't necessarily view biopolitical control over plants as necessarily like inherently a bad thing. Do you think it is, or I feel like there's ways that it can be very symbiotic and not necessarily like manipulative or detrimental.
Well, and I think that speaks to another aspect of this plant turn, if we want to think of it that way, right? The move towards critical plant studies is our ethics around plants. Like we've got a lot of work to do, right? We've got a lot of work to do to think about what does it mean to have an ethical relationship with plant life in terms of farming, in terms of scientific experimentation. A lot of that comes down to what extent we view plants as living beings, right? And as a different kind of living being, right? Experimenting on a plant can look fundamentally very different than experimenting on a non-human animal, for example, right? Me personally, that's a difficult question. I will say that I'm fascinated by it, and a lot of this comes down to like GMO stuff, right? I mean, this is another area where, yeah, again, our ethics, we need to figure some of this stuff out. The humanities is a great place for that, right? That said, I am somebody who recently ordered the first bioluminescent houseplant that is available on the US market. Very recently made available through the FDA, like was approved, so you can buy this, but it's genetically engineered, right? It's a bioluminescent petunia. I'm fascinated by it. I love it. I love to look at it. I put it out in the sun in the day. I bring it in at night. I take photos of it glowing at night. But my ethical relationship with that plant, I mean, it's something that I'm still thinking about and working through, and hopefully we'll write about one day. But I think you're pushing some very key questions there, for sure. Yeah.
First of all, thank you so much for this talk.
Thank you.
It's really been great to be here. I'm really interested in this idea of like the love life of moss.
Yeah.
The specificity of that term, because of course that's so different to the idea of the like reproducing moss
Mhm.
or breeding moss. Like the love life of moss, it's got something so different going on. This idea of making the moss fall in love. I think for me the difference is that generally you fall in love with somebody or with something.
Right.
And I'm wondering, in the context of this particular story, who, like, is it Nisuke? Is he the one
Yes, yeah.
Who's he trying to make the moss fall in love with? Is it with the moss? Is it with him? What's his role in it? What's the role of Machiko? Or can we not even talk about it in those terms? Do you think?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think at a very practical level, it is about the moss falling in love with other moss, but even that's a very tricky thing, right? Because it's what is a moss, right? I mean, moss, and this is something Kimmerer writes about as well. I mean, we think about moss in the multiplicity, right? It is something, and it's the way it's described in the story is as this multiple being, right? And again, if we get into the science of it and think about the life cycle being more than one generation for a singular entity, what is it falling in love with? I mean, it's a good question, and it's not to forget that moss can reproduce sexually, and asexually as well, right? And so there's an element of cloning, right, of asexual reproduction that's also at play here. So what's interesting is it's all told through Machiko's perspective, right? Now, we hear them talk, the brothers talk a lot, right? And there is a moment where we do get a brief insert where the story shows us Niisuke's writing, his scientific writing, right? There's a little excerpt from his notes, and it looks like scientific writing, right? So if anybody is familiar with like early 20th century Japanese scientific writing, it's all kanji and katakana, right? It formally looks like science writing. Machiko says it's her favorite thing to read, and it reads like poetry. So, I think this is engaging with science, but she's also playing with it, right? There is a creative engagement with science here. So I don't know that the story has a clear answer to what that is, and maybe that fuzziness is the point, right?
With is the wrong preposition. It's more like among or something like
Yeah,
that.
yeah. But so, you know, if we take the, you know, asexual reproduction seriously, then it could be in love with oneself, right? And certainly Machiko is alone a lot in the story, right? And I mean, there's a lot of, the manga adaptation did a good job of showing the doppelganger Machiko. So doppelgangers are something that Osaki was fascinated with, and this is also a reason why like the erotic, grotesque nonsense often gets applied to her, because doppelgangers were a particular fascination with that cultural milieu. But for Osaki, the doppelganger, again, was filtered through the botanical, right? Through plants and cloning, but also, again, poetry. So for the complet folks in the room, if anybody's familiar with William Sharp, the poet William Sharp was a Scottish poet who became famous by writing under a female pseudonym, Fiona MacLeod. And it was only discovered later in life that this was actually William Sharp's work. Osaki is fascinated by MacLeod/Sharp, right? So the idea of these two poets in one body, male and female, this kind of gets us back to, I don't know if trans moss, right? But we can see how Osaki is very interested in multiple selves inhabiting a single body. And I think, the love life of moss kind of filters into that too, so, yeah. Yeah,
Can I ask a question?
please.
So, this is the inevitable pre-modern question.
Oh, I love it, yeah.
You know, the Machiko, the character in the novella,
Mm-hmm.
you may have already cued into this, but if you flip it, it's Komachi, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And which
Ono no
evokes
Komachi.
one of the most famous female poets from the Japanese waka tradition,
Yep.
Ono no Komachi,
Yep.
right? And Komachi herself, she is noted for her use of plants for a couple things, one of which would be Buddhist allegory,
Right.
demonstrative of impermanence and change, that sort of thing, but also sometimes simultaneously allegorical thing about her, you know, the internal workings of the persona, whether it's her or not, of course, that's, you know, we'll leave that aside.
Sure.
The poetic persona, right?
Sure.
And so I wish I could claim that the, you know, catching the name as mine, but I guess Elisa Friedman and Kyoko Selden.
Yeah.
Maybe others as well.
Right. It's kind of referenced in the story obliquely.
Okay.
She says something in the story of like, you know, my name is not befitting, or something, because she's trying to be a poet, right? And so she writes something and it says something like, oh, the poem was not up to par for someone with a name like mine, or something like that. So there is this sort of vague reference that Ono Machiko is definitely a reference to. Yes.
So are there other instances within the story or of her larger body of writings of the, so-called Japanese waka tradition, or are her interests in poetry more occidental?
Yeah, much more. I don't know of any other references that I can think of offhand. The poetry that, her own poetry is much more modern, right? Not engaging with the classical tradition. Although that brief sort of mention, like she's clearly playing with the Komachi story and myth there. She does reference, Izanagi and Izanami in that film review. So there are bits and pieces of it, but if you look at her larger work, she's interested in William Sharp. Charlie Chaplin, loves Charlie Chaplin. Talks a lot about Charlie Chaplin. Film was a big thing for her. Her relationship with the classical tradition is not something I've seen much outside of that, but that's pretty significant, right? And I feel like somebody better studied in Komachi's work, right, could probably find all kinds of parallels that I'm not even aware of, right? So it'd be really interesting to kind of look back at Komachi's writing. I mean, arguably the most well-known waka poet, right, of woman poet, or at least somebody whose beauty, right? I mean, that's part of it as well, is right. There's this myth of her being the most beautiful woman.
Right.
Right.
So there's that legend, and then there's the sort of medieval moralization on, her permissive sexual style.
Right.
Condemned her to some kind of fate as aging by herself in a poor, impoverished, very modest circumstances, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
It somehow, but again, this is all lore. This
Right.
is the realm of lore. We have
Right.
no idea.
Right.
But it was just people. It was a very compelling storyline,
Yeah.
and it went in several different vectors through the centuries. Up until she was recanonized as one of the great waka poets,
Right.
like along with Pariwara no Narikira.
Right. Yeah. So that would be something. I would love to look more into because I do feel like there's a lot there. But as far as Osaki's relationship to the canon, not something I've seen a whole lot of.
Got it. How you doing?
I'm fine. I'm fine. I apologize if my voice sounds a little scratchy, but otherwise I'm good.
Well, we do have one more on the digital. If you want to take it,
Sure.
You have for it. Okay.
Yeah.
And this, I'm Lauren. I'm moving towards your questions, and she has two, and I'm going to give you the choice of which. They're both very brief. Do you have thoughts about OA's The Clever Rain Tree? Is the first question. And do you have thoughts about Standing Woman by Yasutaka Tsutsui? And obviously we don't have time for both, but if you'd like to take one or the other.
I'm much more interested in Yasutaka than Oe, to be honest. Although Oe, there's so much to say about Oe and plant life and trees, and I would. I feel like that's a much bigger conversation. Tsutsui Yasutaka's Standing Woman is a work that I initially, when I first conceived of the book project, thought I would write about because it's very literally the sort of encapsulation of this becoming botanical. So it's a for anyone who doesn't know, Tsutsui Yasutaka is one of the most famous, if not the most sort of preeminent Japanese science fiction writers, a highly controversial figure. You could look into it if you want, but somebody who's very prolific and has been translated into English quite a bit, including this story. And in the story, somebody, a woman, it sort of envisions a dystopian imaginary where people are turned into trees for speaking out against the government, I think is maybe a short way to say it. So there's this whole element of censorship to it. And so I am fascinated by that story because it's part of this recurring trope or this thing that we see in a lot of Japanese writers. So I do, in the book, have a chapter about Abe Kobo's Dendrocacalia, which is another story of someone turning into a tree. Even going back to Sato Haruo, right, a much earlier writer, he has this story of humans being turned into plants. And these are all sort of dystopian stories, right? And so I think this is something that, again, Professor Meeker speaks very eloquently about my work, and I'm always love hearing her speak about my work. But that potentiality, right, for things to go either towards the utopian or the dystopian. Tsutsui, I think, because he's such a tricky writer and he's so cynical, I don't know that there's a lot of possibility or potential. I mean, there's a sort of satire in Standing Woman that I think is interesting, but it's a pretty dark story. I think it really leans into the dystopian, and I think it also really discounts plants and plant life quite a bit. It just imagines plants as these silent beings, you know, that it's the worst fate imaginable to be turned into a tree, right? This is kind of a horrific image in that story, and I think it does that well, but I'm interested in the ambivalence, right? Figures like Osaki, like Hiromi Ito, like Abe Kobo, who recognize the dystopian possibilities, the ways that the state, people in power can, biopolitically, whatever, sort of use plants to different ends, but still find some potential for resistance, right? And that oscillation between the two is really, I think, the heart of my project. So I think Tsutsui gets a footnote. I think I footnote Standing Woman, and it's a text that I teach, but for this current project, it's lacking something of that potential that I'm searching out. So,
Okay.
yeah.
Well,
Okay.
thank you.
Thank you.
So much.
Thank you all so much. Thanks to everybody out there.